Our final theory on star forts brings us to the fringes of history. The Tartarian theory has many nuances and different versions, and it deserves a whole series on its own, which will definitely happen in the future, but for now, we're going to take a look at the Tartarian theory in relation to star forts. Now keep in mind a lot of this is just theory, so if you have any ideas or thoughts on it that you want to discuss, please put them in the comments, or come and talk to me on Patreon. I'll link that below. The theory goes that the Tartarians, or the Tartars, were a high civilization with technology that spanned all of mainland Asia, the Middle East, Europe, North Africa, and North America. And they originally came from the Atlanteans, after the Great Flood. But where exactly they began after Atlantis is debated. The Mind Unveiled channel has an interesting theory about them coming from Ireland, and after that migrating east to become the Phoenicians. It's also likely that they could have come to the Fertile Crescent and began the civilizations of Mesopotamia, the Canaanite Phoenicians, Egypt, and several others. Scholars aren't sure exactly where the Tartars originated from, but they usually say it's most likely they came from the Caucasus Mountain region, or Turkey. These were essentially the Indo-Europeans. We see their language groups span across Asia and Europe, but where did they come from? Scholars debate this, but among YouTube theorists, which is where this theory comes from, they mostly agree that they originated with the Phoenicians. They point to several things. First is similarity in language, a coexistence in the same region of the Mediterranean at the same time period, as well as the countless times the region of Canaan has been taken over in the ancient world. There are many stories, including in the Bible, of the Israelites and the Phoenicians fleeing their original homeland. This is where the stories of the lost 10 tribes come from. We still don't definitively know where these lost 10 tribes went, but the Tartarian theory says some of them, especially the northern Phoenician city-states, traveled to the land of the Tartarians just north of them in Turkey, and became the nomadic tribes like the Scythians, and later Huns and Mongols. This would have made a lot of sense for them, as their ancestors originated as nomadic people. And the Phoenicians had good relationships with the people of these regions, as they engaged in trade. This is a similar occurrence we see later in history when the Romans take over the Phoenician city-states, and they flee to Carthage. We also find a lot of similarities between the Scythians and Phoenicians. For one, their reverence of the horse. The Phoenicians were expert horse breeders, and traded their horses all over. They also used the horse as a motif in much of their artwork, and even adorned their ships with the head of a horse. The Scythians revered the horse even more, as it was their primary method of transportation, and also used in much of their art and symbolism as well. The Scythians and the other Indo-European tribes spread eastward down into India, and westward into Europe. We trace this through their language, which spans almost all of Asia and Europe. Genghis Khan was trying to control the entire people of Tartary, including his European cousins. We can also find similarities across Asia and Europe in their technology, how they aligned their structures and built monuments. They were advanced civilizations with knowledge of celestial alignments, astrology, science, mathematics, geometry, advanced medicine, as well as architecture, and who knows what else. The theory goes that star forts were built by these earlier civilizations, or maybe they possibly go back to something even earlier. Do you know that the Otzi Iceman, as they call him, was a mummy that was found in the Alps who was dated to around 7000 BC, and he had tattoos on his skin along his acupuncture points. This was a technology that was thought to have originated in China in the 3rd century BC. Well, it's clear that it originated much earlier, among these Indo-Europeans, and eventually made its way to China, which was also part of this Tartary nation. At some point, a high civilization was established that could have spanned this whole region. We also find cities in Siberia on old maps and regions that are completely barren now. Here's the Fra Mauro map from 1450 depicting massive cities and great castles all across northern Asia and Siberia, and it speaks of Tartars in conjunction with the people throughout Asia and Russia. Some of these maps are said to be based off the travels of Marco Polo himself. The theory continues to say that the Tartarians eventually made it across the Bering Strait and into America, which, if they had cities in Siberia, would have been an easy task. And again, old maps show Tartarian-looking buildings and cities in America before anything was supposed to be there. Here's the Mercator map of the North Pole from the 16th century showing cities in northern Siberia and North America. Here's the Piri Reis map from 1513 showing castles already in America, as well as a boat in the North Atlantic traveling to America wearing hats or helmets that look similar to something we'd see in the Mongolia region. And we even see it in the DNA of Native Americans. Scientists have now concluded that Native Americans are descended from people in Mongolia and Siberia. These were the Tartars. Why do you think Columbus called them the Indians? He may as well just call them the Tartars because India was also labeled as Tartary on old maps, some of which may have been based off the ones Columbus was using. I've heard stories of many Native Americans not mind being referred to as Indians because they actually do originate from Asia. There was a great high civilization that was eventually lost in Siberia and North America, originally coming from the Indo-European Tartar tribes. The Catholics knew about this due to their Phoenician connections, and they covered it up by inhabiting the various star forts and wiping out everything they could find in America, destroying ruins, burying things, or building on top of them. Just take a look at the largest pyramid in the world. It's in Mexico, and it's buried still to this day, and there's a Catholic church built right on top of it. Star forts are located mostly in Europe, but also in other port cities around the world and in the Americas. Basically all across this land we refer to as Tartaria, and where the Phoenicians traveled. The theory states that these star forts were advanced technology, preceded only by the pyramids and megalithic structures of the ancient world, and Atlantis before that. These structures were built by advanced peoples and only later covered up and repurposed by the Romans and Holy Roman Catholics, who also came from Hebrew and Phoenician origins. The Catholic Church was started by the apostles of Jesus, who were of course Jews from Israel. The Apostle Peter is known as the first pope, and he was from Galilee, a neighboring region in northern Israel to several Phoenician city-states. The Phoenicians and Jews had been intermarrying and sharing culture for centuries by this point, going all the way back to the time of Solomon. We know this from the Old Testament that the Phoenicians were originally descended from the Canaanites, that lived in their region before the migration of the Hebrews from Egypt. The Canaanites and the later Phoenicians were the pagans spoken about in the Bible, the worshippers of gods like Baal or Dagon. They would practice rituals like human sacrifice. And in the Bible there's a common theme of the Israelites falling into these pagan ways and worshipping these gods. Many say this is eventually what also happened to the Catholic Romans, abandoning their true religion for power and greed, causing them to cover up true history and lie on a grand scale to keep this power and keep the masses asleep. They knew the true purpose of star forts and other advanced technologies and didn't want it to interfere with their influence over the world. And they did this with other buildings, not just star forts. The Catholics would convert pagan temples into churches all across Rome. And they would place churches on top of sacred pagan sites all over the world. They were also burning every book that didn't align with them that they could. They were doing this all across Asia, Africa, and the Americas. One of the worst instances of this is the Mayan texts. Only a handful of Mayan codices have survived. I have a whole video on this if you want to check it out. It's called Lost Mayan Texts. We have no idea what could have been hiding in these indigenous histories. In North America, we find what are essentially pyramids and ruins at sites like Cahokia, Spiro, Poverty Point, and thousands of others. And what do you know is often right next to these mounds? Star forts. Go ahead, go to your Google Maps and find where your local star fort is if you live in the US, and then search for cities named Mound, Mounds, Mounds Park, or something like that. You might be surprised, especially if you live along the Mississippi River. So could it be possible that these star forts were later renditions of these energy collecting pyramids? Theory goes that the Tartarians also made it to America, either after the sinking of Atlantis or sometime later from the Pacific side. And there are these same stories of civilization bringers throughout the Americas. I love the Aztec origin story. They claim the original place they and the other Mesoamerican people came from was an island on a massive lake called Aztlan, and I find it so similar phonetically to Atlantis. Anyway, the Roman Catholic churches who funded the colonization of America. They controlled most of the European royals and sent them on specific missions in America to cover up this history. Columbus knew he was going to the land of the Indians, or Tartars. Cortez knew he would be accepted as a god by the Aztecs. And Francisco de Orellana knew when he saw the people of the Amazon that they were related to the fierce Amazonian warriors told of in Greek legend, most commonly equated to the Scythians. Star forts, pyramids, and even Tartarian buildings were already here when they got here. and they speak of this in their writings. Orellana speaks of a massive civilization along the Amazon that we've only just recently uncovered with LiDAR scanning. The Mesoamericans built the largest pyramids in the world that were completely buried when archaeologists found them in the 18th and 19th centuries. And the great mound structures of North America were once huge pyramidal structures as well. Not to mention other stories from early European explorers, like that of the city of golden pillars and pearls known as Norumbega in the northeast, or the city of gold El Dorado in South America. There's also stories of advanced people living in the west coast of North America. And again, we see these great cities that shouldn't be there on old maps. This theory has one more part to it: the mud flood theory, or cataclysm theory, or historical reset theory. Basically, this is the idea that cataclysms are more common in our past than we have been led to believe. And I'm not just talking about the Great Flood or the Flood of Atlantis, but all kinds of cataclysms. We find much evidence for this in old writings. Plato's Timaeus speaks of several past civilization resets, not just Atlantis. So does the Hopi creation story on the other side of the world. If you study the ancient structures, you'll find patterns that you just can't ignore. For one, almost every ancient site is buried under feet of dirt. Oftentimes, entire cities lay beneath the ground. Cities are also built on top of older ones that no one knows the origins of. And entire civilizations have been left forgotten until we find their buried ruins and artifacts. The star forts are more often than not buried as well, or at least half buried or left in complete ruin or forgotten altogether. This could be evidence that they go back to a time earlier than previously thought. There are many of these resets that are said to have happened, one of them being during the decline of the Roman Empire, bringing us into the Dark Ages. When this happened, the Roman Catholics used this as an opportunity to reset history and begin creating our new narrative. Every historical text that was written down at the time was done so by the hand of the clergy. Things can easily be forged and changed this way, and the Catholic Church has been known to attempt to delete texts and entire histories. Alright, we've talked about a lot here. There's some things I definitely want to go further in depth on in the future. I feel like we've only scratched the surface, but this is definitely a good starting point. If you have any thoughts you want to share, please give us a comment, and if you want to talk to me directly or have a discussion on these topics, you can reach me on my Patreon. I'll link that below. Thank you so much if you made it all the way to the end, and I'll see you next time.